I lied to my pick-me friend, and she got a tattoo based off of it. This all started about a year ago, and even now, whenever I think about it, I can't help but laugh uncontrollably at the absurdity of what happened, because it was one of those situations that is simultaneously ridiculous, stressful, and jaw-dropping all at once. I had recently started spending more time with a coworker named Lisa, who, on the surface, seemed perfectly normal, friendly, chatty, and polite enough to make a good first impression. She had just joined our department and was eager to fit in, which I initially assumed was harmless, just someone excited about a new environment and looking to make connections. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt because I tend to be the type who sees the best in people, especially those who are new and trying to navigate social dynamics in a professional setting. At first, Lisa was enthusiastic, always joining in on group lunches, asking questions about our work, and participating in casual conversations. She laughed at jokes, commented on shared interests, and even tried to mimic some of our group's inside jokes, creating an impression that she belonged naturally, almost instantly. But beneath this friendly facade, I started noticing subtle behaviors that didn't sit right with me. They were tiny things at first. Small comments about my work habits being a little dramatic, or questions about why I did certain things in a particular way, phrased as curiosity but tinged with judgment. It was like walking on eggshells, constantly second guessing whether her remarks were innocent or pointed, and over time it became clear that these moments weren't random. She had a way of catching me off guard, and though it was never overtly aggressive, it was unsettling. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe she just had a different sense of humor, maybe she was socially awkward, or maybe I was too sensitive. But a pattern began to emerge, and I realized very quickly that Lisa wasn't just socially clumsy. She seemed to thrive on subtly manipulating situations to make herself look clever, all while keeping up a perfectly innocent facade. The tipping point came when I decided to invite her to one of our monthly game nights. I thought maybe this would help her integrate with the group in a more natural way and perhaps give me a chance to see her personality in a relaxed, social setting. This was a huge mistake. From the moment she arrived, Lisa positioned herself at the center of attention. She constantly interjected during games, corrected others, exaggerated my mistakes in a way that made everyone laugh at my expense, and somehow made it seem like she was just being playful, charming, and funny, when in reality, she was orchestrating chaos. She spilled wine on my favorite throw blanket and then laughed, pretending it was funny and subtly implying it was my fault. During charades, she deliberately misread my gestures, exaggerating my actions to make it seem like I was incompetent, and the way she did it made everyone watch, stare, and laugh, leaving me in a state of disbelief. I tried to remain calm, to not let her see how frustrated I was, but internally I was torn between anger, astonishment, and the sheer incredulity of how audacious someone could be. It was like watching a carefully scripted performance unfold, with me as the unwilling star. By the end of the night, I was mentally exhausted. I had a combination of frustration at being targeted, awe at her boldness, and a strange sense of admiration at her commitment to chaos. She wasn't just an awkward social climber, she was a meticulous manipulator, and I realized that every interaction with her moving forward would require careful navigation, strategy, and patience. Little did I know that this was only the beginning of an escalation that would lead to one of the most ridiculous and unforgettable experiences of my life. A series of events culminating in a permanent tattoo that I had invented on the spot, which Lisa had gotten exactly as I described, despite it being entirely fake. Looking back, that first night was the opening act, a preview of the absurdity to come, and it's almost miraculous how one casual invitation led to such a chaotic and hilariously dramatic chain of events. Because from that point forward, Lisa's obsession with being involved, impressing, and outshining me in the most subtle and calculated ways became the driving force behind everything that followed, setting the stage for a story so ridiculous, so absurd, that even now I have trouble convincing people it actually happened. He's tall, effortlessly funny, and somehow has this charisma that makes people gravitate toward him instantly. He wasn't interested in Lisa romantically, as far as I knew, but she seemed to fixate on him almost immediately, like a heat-seeking missile that zeroed in on anyone who could boost her social status in our group. Almost immediately, I started noticing changes in her behavior whenever he was around. She would subtly attempt to undermine me in ways that were small enough to be deniable, but precise enough to be effective. For instance, if I was sharing a story or contributing to a conversation, she would interject with an exaggerated reaction or a question designed to make me seem dramatic, incompetent, or overly sensitive. Sometimes she would laugh a second too late, mimicking amusement in a way that subtly made it seem like my joke or comment wasn't funny. She would occasionally whisper comments under her breath, pretending they were innocent, but strategically timed so that Sam or other coworkers would overhear them, creating tiny moments where I would feel exposed or awkward. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking that maybe I was imagining things or being overly sensitive, but the pattern was unmistakable. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It became consistent, almost ritualistic. Every single time Sam entered the room, Lisa's attention shifted in an almost predatory way. She would adjust her posture, her voice, and even her expressions to draw attention to herself, while subtly pushing me into the background. I realized that she wasn't just socially competitive. She thrived on controlling the narrative, on making sure she appeared more likable, cleverer, or more exciting than I did in any given interaction. It was exhausting to maintain my own composure around her because I had to constantly anticipate her moves, filter my words, and be hyper-aware of every facial expression, every gesture, every slight that could be twisted into an opportunity for her. Over time, it became like playing chess with a novice who insists on making every move dramatic and flashy while simultaneously undermining the other player. Except this novice was relentless, and the stakes were my dignity, my social reputation, and my patience. There were moments where I almost wanted to confront her directly, to call her out on the ridiculous lengths she went to just to feel superior. But I realized that confrontation would probably backfire spectacularly, giving her even more material to manipulate the situation. Instead, I decided to bide my time, to stay calm, and to wait for the right opportunity to tip the scales in a harmless but hilariously satisfying way. And that opportunity presented itself in the most unexpected form: a conversation about tattoos. At this point, I had been planning a small, personal tattoo for months, a delicate constellation that represented my connection with my mom. It wasn't a trendy tattoo, it wasn't flashy, it wasn't intended to impress anyone else. It was deeply sentimental, carefully planned with my tattoo artist over several months. Naturally, Lisa overheard me talking about it one afternoon while we were in the break room, and her reaction was immediate and over the top. Her eyes widened, her grin stretched from ear to ear, and she bombarded me with questions about placement, color, style, meaning, every detail I had painstakingly considered. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she absorbed every word, her enthusiasm bordering on obsession. That's when the idea struck me. I could have a little fun, harmlessly, with someone who so thoroughly underestimated the absurdity of their own dedication. I told her about a completely fake tattoo idea, something I invented on the spot, a detailed moon and stars design supposedly inspired by an obscure indie movie I claim to love. I went into extreme detail about placement, color, line thickness, even a fabricated backstory about the fictional characters it represented. Lisa nodded eagerly, taking mental notes, and I assumed she would either forget it, dismiss it, or use it as vague inspiration. I could not have been more wrong. She not only remembered it, she apparently cataloged every detail in her mind, planning how she could commit to it permanently. Over the next few days, I started noticing little signs that she was considering it seriously. The way she brought it up casually in conversations, the subtle hints she dropped to mutual friends, the way she asked me for clarification on tiny aspects of the design. It was almost as if she wanted reassurance that she was getting every detail right, which made me both laugh and cringe at the same time. I could not believe that someone could be so committed to an idea that was entirely fabricated, but at the same time, I had to admit that it was a perfect, almost poetic form of social payback. After months of subtle psychological games and one-upmanship, the universe had presented me with an opportunity to witness her obsession play out in the most extreme and permanent form imaginable, and I was not about to let it go to waste. It became almost impossible to focus on anything else, because the anticipation of what she might actually do was so ludicrous that every interaction with her started to feel like a prelude to a punchline in a story I couldn't wait to tell later. I didn't know exactly how far she would take it, but I had a front row seat to what would soon become one of the most absurd and unforgettable events in my adult life. An event so ridiculous it would involve a tattoo, a completely fabricated story, and a level of commitment that no rational person could have predicted. The situation had escalated beyond mere annoyance or social awkwardness. It was now entering legendary, almost cinematic territory, and I could barely contain my excitement, mixed with a healthy dose of disbelief, as I realized that Lisa's obsession with Sam and her relentless drive to outdo or impress had unwittingly created the perfect storm for one of the most hilarious pranks I would ever witness. The tattoo conversation was where things went from amusingly tense to absolutely insane, and I still can't believe it actually happened. I had been planning a small personal tattoo for months, a delicate, sentimental constellation on my wrist representing the bond between my mom and me. It wasn't trendy, flashy, or meant to impress anyone. It was deeply personal, a quiet tribute, something I had been designing with my tattoo artist over many months to make sure it was perfect. Naturally, Lisa overheard me talking about it while we were in the break room one afternoon, and her reaction was instant and dramatic. Her eyes widened to an almost cartoonish size, her grin stretched unnaturally wide, and she leaned in so close I could practically feel her enthusiasm radiating off her. She immediately began bombarding me with questions about the placement, colors, size, style, and even the meaning behind it. I could literally see the gears turning in her head, and it was in that precise moment that inspiration struck me. I could play a harmless little prank, a creative bit of payback for months of her obsessive manipulative behavior. I decided to tell her about a completely fake tattoo idea, inventing a story and design on the spot that had never existed and would never exist, except, apparently, in her mind. I told her it was a detailed moon and stars design inspired by an obscure indie movie I claimed to love, going into painstaking detail about placement, the exact shades of color, the thickness of each line, even a fabricated backstory about the characters in the movie and how they symbolized parts of my life. Lisa listened with rapt attention, nodding enthusiastically, taking in every word like a blueprint she could use to guide her actions. I assumed she would either forget it, dismiss it as too elaborate, or maybe just use it as vague inspiration, because after all, who actually follows through on something so over the top based on someone else's story, right? That assumption would soon be proven tragically, hilariously wrong. Over the next few days, Lisa started bringing up the tattoo casually, dropping hints in conversation, asking mutual friends for tiny clarifications, and somehow managing to make it seem normal, as if she wasn't obsessing over every detail I had fabricated. I noticed the intensity of her interest, and I began to realize that she was not just intrigued, she was planning to commit to it fully. It was surreal watching someone become so utterly obsessed with something that didn't exist. At first, I felt a pang of guilt. After all, this was permanent, and she clearly didn't know the full story. But that quickly morphed into astonishment, then outright laughter. The thought that someone would tattoo something so detailed and intricate purely because of my creative deception was almost too much to comprehend. I started imagining what it would look like. A giant, carefully executed piece of art based on a story that only existed in my head. My friends, when I told them about it, were equally incredulous. One of them laughed so hard they almost fell off their chair. "She's going to actually do it?" they asked incredulously, and I shrugged, half in disbelief myself. The absurdity of it all was almost cinematic. Meanwhile, Lisa continued to ask for tiny clarifications about shades of color, line placement, the exact positioning of moons and stars, and even how certain fictional elements should interact with each other in the design. It was like she was studying for a final exam on my imaginary tattoo. At this point, I realized that this prank had escalated far beyond what I had anticipated. I had expected maybe a small homage, maybe a doodle inspired by my story, but not a full-blown, meticulously executed, permanent commitment. I started documenting every interaction, partly to remind myself of how insane it all was, and partly so I could laugh about it endlessly later. In the back of my mind, I imagined her sitting in the tattoo chair, the artist leaning over with a needle, and her explaining the elaborate backstory as though it were canon, completely unaware that it had been fabricated purely for entertainment. I could picture the reaction of anyone else who would see the tattoo. Confusion, shock, disbelief. And honestly, I felt a mix of emotions myself. There was amusement, yes, but also a strange sense of awe at her sheer commitment. No one could have anticipated that someone would take such a meticulously fabricated story and turn it into a permanent piece of art on their body. It was the perfect combination of human obsession, overcommitment, and absurd humor. I began to appreciate the subtle poetic justice of it. Lisa, who had spent months subtly undermining me, obsessing over my interactions, and attempting to manipulate social dynamics, had now unwittingly immortalized my prank in a way that she would carry with her forever. The universe had presented the perfect opportunity, and I had orchestrated it without anyone realizing it, including Lisa herself. Over the next few days, I found myself checking in with mutual friends to see if they had noticed any signs that Lisa was moving forward with the tattoo. Every little detail she asked about, every casual reference she made, seemed to confirm that this was happening. I oscillated between disbelief and uncontrollable laughter, sometimes imagining scenarios where the tattoo artist asked for clarification, and she launched into a detailed, overly serious explanation of my fabricated story, leaving everyone in the shop baffled. The thought of this unfolding in real life, in all its meticulous, obsessive glory, made me laugh so hard I had to remind myself to breathe. I realized that I had accidentally created a living legend, a story so ridiculous and perfectly executed that it would be retold among my friends for years, each retelling more dramatic than the last. It was absurd, ridiculous, and utterly hilarious, and yet it was all real, and that somehow made it even better. 2 weeks after I told Lisa about the completely fabricated tattoo idea, I received a message from a mutual friend. "You won't believe it. Lisa got the tattoo." At first, I laughed, thinking it was a joke, imagining maybe a tiny crescent moon on her ankle or a discrete star somewhere on her arm. I didn't take it seriously, because who actually commits to a tattoo based entirely on someone else's made-up story? But the more I thought about it, the more my heart started to race with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. My friend sent me a photo, and when I saw it, I genuinely froze. My jaw literally dropped. She had gone full on, exactly as I described it. Every line, every star, every moon, every subtle detail of my fabricated story had been meticulously recreated in ink on her arm. It was huge, intricate, and perfectly executed. I sat down because the sheer audacity of it all hit me like a freight train. I couldn't stop laughing, crying, and mentally screaming at the same time. My first thought was a tiny pang of guilt. After all, this was permanent, and she clearly didn't know the tattoo was entirely fake. But that quickly shifted to pure, unadulterated astonishment. The commitment she had shown to something that existed only in my imagination was beyond anything I could have predicted. I called a few close friends immediately, showing them the photo, and their reactions mirrored mine exactly. Laughter, disbelief, and a kind of stunned awe. "She actually did it?" one friend asked, nearly choking on their own words. Another laughed so hard they fell off the couch. The absurdity of it all was almost cinematic in nature. I couldn't stop picturing the tattoo session itself. Lisa sitting in the chair, the artist leaning over with the needle, and her explaining every tiny detail of a story that was entirely fabricated, insisting that every color, line, and celestial element be perfect. I imagined the tattoo artist's reaction: confusion, silent judgment, perhaps a tiny smirk at the sheer dedication, and yet compliance because it was her body and her money. Meanwhile, I kept imagining how she would show it off to others, explaining the emotional and symbolic significance of a movie, characters, and a story that never existed. My mind was simultaneously blown and highly entertained. The entire situation was like watching a perfectly executed prank unfold in real life, but with one tiny twist. She had no idea it was a prank, which made it even more hilarious. Over the next several days, I could not stop thinking about it. Every time I saw a text message from Lisa or a social media post, I pictured her animatedly describing the tattoo's intricate details, the meaning behind the moons and stars, and the symbolism that she believed existed. I laughed so hard imagining the mental gymnastics she had gone through to commit to this, all based on something I made up in a moment of mischievous inspiration. The absurdity of her overcommitment became almost a daily source of entertainment for me. At the same time, there was a strange kind of admiration I couldn't deny. Admiration for her audacity, her meticulousness, and the sheer scale of what she had done. I mean, most people might have gotten a tiny homage tattoo, something small or symbolic, but she went all in, committing fully to something that had zero grounding in reality, and she did it with pride. I started checking with friends who had been present when I fabricated the story, and their confirmations only made it funnier. One friend told me that Lisa had actually said, "She's going to freak out when she sees this, but it's too perfect," which made me laugh so hard I had to sit down again. The entire scenario felt almost surreal, like a perfectly orchestrated comedy that had written itself. There was a mix of disbelief, amazement, and pure joy in watching someone execute my little fabricated story to perfection, turning it into something permanent and unforgettable. It became a legendary story among our circle of friends, one that we would recount repeatedly, laughing louder and louder each time. Imagining her explaining the tattoo in detail to anyone who asked, believing it to be a story with deep emotional significance, made every retelling more ridiculous and hilarious. I started noticing small details I hadn't anticipated: how she positioned the tattoo, how proud she looked showing it off, the way she referenced the movie and fictional story as if it were canon, and even how she casually compared her tattoo to mine, oblivious to the fact that mine didn't exist in that form. The entire thing became a living, breathing testament to human obsession, overcommitment, and absolute dedication to an idea, one that was entirely fake. The mixture of absurdity, hilarity, and awe made me reflect on human nature in a way I had never experienced before. This was beyond social manipulation. This was obsession meeting overcommitment, with a generous sprinkling of gullibility, and it was all wrapped up in a hilarious, permanent tattoo. Every time I thought about it, I couldn't help but marvel at the perfect storm that led to this moment. Months of subtle social games, petty jealousy, and obsessive behavior had finally culminated in an act so ridiculous, so completely over the top, that it became a story I would tell for years, laughing uncontrollably every single time. It was absurd, insane, and utterly unforgettable. A testament to how wildly human behavior can surprise you, and how a tiny, harmless lie can spiral into a permanent, hilarious, and jaw-dropping reality. When Lisa finally showed me the tattoo in person, I couldn't even decide how to react at first. She was grinning ear to ear, radiating pride and excitement, insisting that we were now tattoo twins, and that this was the coolest thing ever. On the outside, I smiled politely, trying to act composed, but inside, I was a chaotic storm of laughter, disbelief, and mild panic at the sheer audacity of what had just happened. I had spent months carefully crafting a harmless story, never imagining that she would take it literally, meticulously, and permanently. And yet here she was, carrying my entire fictional creation on her arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. Part of me felt guilty. After all, she had actually done something permanent, and this was technically my prank. But that guilt was immediately drowned out by the overwhelming hilarity of the situation. I could not believe that someone could commit so fully to an idea that had zero basis in reality, and do it with such seriousness, dedication, and pride. I found myself imagining the process: Lisa sitting in the tattoo chair, explaining to the artist each line, each curve, each tiny celestial detail, as though she were narrating an epic story. The artist must have thought she was crazy, but she didn't waver. She wanted it perfect. I laughed uncontrollably, thinking about her poring over every minor detail, double-checking that her moon was the right shade, that each star was placed exactly where I had said, that the story behind the tattoo aligned perfectly with my fabricated narrative. It was absurd in every imaginable way, and yet it was real. Over the next few weeks, the tattoo became a recurring source of amusement for both me and my friends. Every time she mentioned it, described it, or showed it to someone, I had to mentally prepare myself for another round of laughter, disbelief, and the occasional dramatic gasp. Friends who had been in the loop from the beginning were nearly in tears from laughing at how perfectly she had executed a story that never existed. One friend even confirmed that Lisa knew the tattoo would shock me when I saw it, which only made the prank more perfect and surreal. The situation had evolved beyond a simple joke or harmless mischief. It had become a permanent testament to human obsession, overcommitment, and the absurdity of social dynamics. It was hilarious, ridiculous, and utterly jaw-dropping. I started noticing little details I hadn't anticipated: the way she positioned her arm to show off certain elements, how she referenced the movie and characters as though they were canon, the pride in her eyes when someone complimented her tattoo. Each moment was a reminder of how spectacularly she had fallen for my fabricated story, and how ridiculously committed she was to bringing my imaginary tattoo to life. It became almost like a legend among my group of friends, a story that we would recount endlessly, each retelling more dramatic and hilarious than the last. I realized that I had accidentally orchestrated one of the most perfect social pranks imaginable, a combination of human obsession, gullibility, and commitment, all wrapped up in one permanent piece of art. Months later, every time I see the tattoo in photos or in person, I burst into laughter. I think about how Lisa, who spent months subtly undermining me, obsessing over my interactions, and trying to assert herself socially, had now immortalized a completely fabricated idea in a way that was permanent, highly detailed, and completely ridiculous. It's almost poetic, in a strange way. The story of the tattoo has become part of our collective memory, a hilarious anecdote that we will tell for years, always with disbelief and laughter. And every time I recount it, people are shocked, entertained, and almost always laugh at the absurdity, because no one could have anticipated the lengths to which Lisa would go. It's a story that perfectly captures the ridiculousness of human behavior, the power of obsession, and the hilarity that can result from a single harmless lie executed at the perfect moment. Looking back, it taught me that you can never underestimate someone's commitment to an idea, no matter how absurd, and that sometimes a harmless prank can turn into a legendary story, one that is far more entertaining than anything I could have imagined. It's a perfect reminder of how unpredictable, hilarious, and jaw-dropping human behavior can be, and how a little creative mischief, carefully executed, can create memories that will last a lifetime, leaving everyone involved simultaneously stunned, amused, and utterly amazed.